Hello everyone and welcome back to POL102. This lecture is going to be on the Constitution, which will correspond to your chapter 2 in the book. So let's get going. First of all, at the outset, it's a good idea just to define what our Constitution is. So the Constitution is our governing document, which outlines how, not only how government is going to be structured, but just as importantly, how our rights are going to be protected under the new government. We'll get into these broad topics here in a bit. More specifically, to outline how this lecture is going to go, we're going to start out with a bit of historical background, talking about how we get from 13 colonies under the rule of Great Britain to a revolution, to the point where the Founding Fathers determined that we need to come up with a new constitution to guide the government going forward. Once we get to that point, we'll be talking about, once we are at the point in time where the founders are sitting down and trying to figure out what the new constitution, the new government is going to look like. What do those debates look like? What are they over? How are they resolved? And ultimately, what does the final document look like? We'll talk after that about what the ratification process ends up looking like as well. Once the document is crafted, it's not just immediately put into effect. The supporters of it have to take their case to the people and to the states in order to try to get enough support to get the minimum threshold to actually ratify it and put it into effect. We'll go over those debates. And then finally, we'll close out by recognizing that the Constitution, though it's been an effective governing document throughout our history, obviously it's imperfect and from time to time needs to be changed. And we'll go over some examples of how it's changed. More importantly, the processes that are in place to outline how it gets changed when it needs to be. Okay, so as I said, we're going to begin with some pretty heavy historical background, I suppose, compared to what we're going to be talking about throughout the rest of the semester. But this is important just to get a sense of what's going on in North America at the time when the Constitution's being crafted, the period leading up to that, and how that informs what eventually goes into the document. To begin with, we usually think of the revolution as maybe more of a military conflict, and obviously the military, the war component of it is important. Without winning against Great Britain, the country obviously wouldn't have ever gotten to the point where we could have even agreed on a constitution of our own. Just as importantly, though, is during this time period, you also have a revolution of ideas going on, changes in the way that people think about government, think about the way that government should relate to the people. Now, a few things of importance to note about the intellectual climate around this period is that the colonial leaders, first of all, believed that the reigning government of Britain was too aggressive, exerted too much power, did things that were beyond what was considered legitimate. And second of all, and maybe more importantly, is that these colonial leaders also agreed that when this is the case, when a government reaches beyond what is legitimate and what should be allowed, the people being ruled have the right to throw out that government and institute a new one of their own. And this is an ideology that's eventually reflected in the Declaration of Independence. It originates mostly from Locke. Eventually, these the intellectual ideological climate leads the colonists, once we declare independence, to want something written down to, first of all, clearly outline the boundaries of what is legitimate for government to do and what isn't. But also, another really core principle of what they're going to put into this document is the belief that sovereignty, in other words, the power and right to rule over a particular geographic area, could be divided into multiple different parts. And you see that reflected in the fact that we have a national government along with various different state governments, one for each state. Even within states, you get down and you have municipalities, localities as well. This is all really innovative stuff, a really unique approach for this period of time. We'll get more into this as we go along to this lecture, and specifically with federalism in the next lecture. We'll be talking about that in a lot more detail. Going forward now, let's just take a little bit of time to get into what the climate is, what specific acts the government of Great Britain is doing during this time to sort of impel and lead the colonial the elites at the time to go down this path, this ideological path that I just talked about. So first of all, taxes are not anything that really anyone likes that much. I think for the most part everyone recognizes them as a necessity. But when you get your paycheck every other week or however often you get it, you don't generally like to look at it and see that you've got a fairly substantial portion of your income taken and given to the government. So, we usually look at them as necessary. We don't enjoy them, but we really don't enjoy them when they're seen as illegitimate, and you don't think that you have a say in how they're being levied, and maybe not in a way that you think is fair. This is probably the single biggest factor leading to the revolution and the Declaration of Independence from Britain. The state of taxation during this time. You've heard the phrase "no taxation without representation." In terms of what the British perspective is, they look at these complaints and say this doesn't make any sense because Parliament represents the entirety of the British Empire. Just because there's no member of Parliament there specifically to represent the colonies in America doesn't mean that they're not represented in a general sense. Of course, the colonists they disagree with this perspective, and they don't view the taxes as any more legitimate, whatever the perspective of the crown is at this time. To point out some specific actions by the British government that stoke the angry feelings and the dissatisfaction with the government of Britain. You have things like the Sugar Act, which is restricting who the colonies can trade with, Stamp Act, which is a broad tax, pretty much any sort of official document, Townshend Acts, again, more taxes. You get into sort of some civil unrest here with the Boston Massacre and Tea Party, two famous events which most of you are probably aware of already. Retaliatory acts by the Crown in the form of political restrictions against Massachusetts specifically, more restrictions on freedom in terms of the Quartering Act. You're required to house British soldiers in your house or your estate. So all this together basically just combines and through time has the effect of growing resentment toward the crown and the colonies. You get scenes like this where again civil unrest often turns violent. This scene is depicting angry colonists tarring and feathering British officials. And eventually this all culminates and we get to the point where the satisfaction is so great, or excuse me, the dissatisfaction is so great that the colonies decide to start banding together and trying to form plans going forward. The first thing that they do, they form the First Continental Congress, which is basically the first governing body, this first self-governing body that's covering the entirety of the colonial realm. I think only one colony failed to send delegates to the Congress. I believe it was Georgia. But for the most part, they're all there, and they're trying to come up with plans to move forward. They recognize that certain situations are untenable in the colonies right now, in terms of the relationship between the colonists and the government of Great Britain. So the first thing they do in this Continental Congress is they put together a comprehensive list of what the grievances are of the colonists, and they send it to the Crown. Among these things, would be discussion of taxation and suppression of political rights by the Crown. These would go in a list, and they send them off to Great Britain, and basically Great Britain ignores it and doesn't really do anything substantial to address their grievances. Around this time, you start getting the first fighting in what would become the Revolutionary War. Eventually, though, a few more months pass by. The Second Continental Congress is formed, and this is really where the colonists are starting to move past the point where they think there's potentially a way to reconcile with Britain, and they start taking actions to try to govern a new nation, basically. These would be things like, first of all, creating an army. That's important if you're going to start rebelling against Great Britain. They're obviously at this time a really great military power. It's going to be a non-trivial task to even if you decide to go down the route of separating yourself from them, it's going to be pretty difficult to do that successfully given their military reach. Things like creating currency, starting to establish diplomacy with other nations. Eventually, during this time, during the Second Continental Congress, they agree that the situation has basically gotten so bad with Britain that there's not really any way to go back. And in July of 1776, the Second Continental Congress signs the Declaration of Independence. So this is the point at which we are officially separate from Great Britain. You no longer have a set of 13 colonies, you have a set of 13 states. And maybe more important in the Declaration than the actual, the practical effect of declaring separation from Britain is the ideology contained therein. So, in some of the most famous lines of American political philosophy ever written down, the Declaration asserts that everyone has a right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. These rights are unalienable. The purpose of government is to protect these rights, and that when government goes down the wrong path and chooses not to protect these rights, but rather to usurp them, that the people being governed have the right and the obligation to abolish and replace the government. So this is really not just declaring independence, but also outlining a really underlying fundamental philosophical set of political beliefs that will inform our country and our government going forward. In the immediate aftermath of the Declaration of Independence, the big question is, how is this new country going to be governed? At this time, the Second Continental Congress is still in session. They haven't disbanded yet. So one of their major tasks following the Declaration of Independence is to outline, put forth a first effort at describing how the new national government is going to look, what its powers are going to be, what its structure is going to be. The Articles of Confederation are the first attempt at this. So this is distinct from what we'll be talking about further on in the lecture, the Constitution that that is eventually arrived at and which still governs us today. The Articles of Confederation could maybe be looked at as the first Constitution that eventually is superseded. The key aspect of the Articles are that they vest most of the power of the new government in the states. So they go into effect in 1777. It's not really that effective of a governing system, though. So most actions of importance require not just a majority, as we're accustomed to today, but an actual unanimous consensus among the 13 states. So this is, you can imagine, very difficult to get anything done when just one state can hold up the entire process if it wants to. So, this results in difficulty for the new government in performing just the basic things that a government has to do. It doesn't have a great way to tax effectively, which is important since we're in the middle of a war and we need to be able to spend money on, the army, the navy. Things like this are difficult to do. We don't have any way to regulate commerce between the states, so each state is free to impose tariffs or restrictions on other states, however it would like, which has the effect of really reducing the efficiency in the economy. Putting forth a coherent foreign policy is difficult because since so much of the power is left to the states, each state can conduct its own foreign policy. So this makes it really difficult to provide a unified front when you have 13 separate entities, all of which are free to do whatever they want to. Difficult to establish a strong national currency as well. Each state oftentimes is seen issuing its own currency, which has the effect of compounding some of these other issues as far as spending and taxing go. Okay, so this goes on for several years. The Articles of Confederation government the problems I just outlined are eventually becoming more and more, well recognized, and you get to the point to where eventually sentiment shifts against the Articles of Confederation, and more people, more states begin to recognize that something has to change here. The first real official attempt at starting this effort is in 1786. Several states meet in Maryland, in Annapolis, and the ultimate outcome of this convention is basically that they agreed to hold a larger convention later on in the next year in order to discuss how we're going to change the structure of government and the powers of government to try to make these problems a little bit better, to allow us to do things like tax, spend on armies, navies, whatever we need to do. How are we going to change what's in place to do that? So eventually they agree on May 1787 in Philadelphia to discuss these things that I'm talking about, these problems. The plan is originally to change the Articles of Confederation to try to make them work better, but once they get into this convention in Philadelphia, it quickly becomes evident that they really need to just scrap them all together and start out with a completely new document. So we get into what becomes a constitutional convention, a convention to write a new constitution. Every state sends delegates there except for Rhode Island. All right, so this topic now, this next topic is going to be discussing what actually goes on at this convention. We've gone through history now for a bit, discussing the sequence of events, and the thoughts, ideologies, and conditions that lead to the new constitutional convention. Let's talk now about what actually goes on there. What are the debates, the main points of contention, and how are they resolved? And, what are the broad principles that eventually inform the document that still governs us today? All right, so the first and maybe the biggest issue in trying to form a new national government involved representation in this government. So you have 13 different states now. You have different interests, within each of these states, within different regions as well. Certain qualities of each state, like population, matter. So a big issue here is just determining how much power and influence each state is going to get within the new national government. And in terms of that, there are two major points of a fracture that we're going to talk about. The first being the population size of each state. The second being the status as either being a slave state or a non-slave state. These two topics both cause considerable problems in figuring out a new form of government that would work for enough of the states that it could be implemented. So you see here, this is just a map of the 13 states as they originally were. A few things to point out, you've got states that vary considerably in population, like Virginia is a really populous state. Some of the northeastern states also pretty populous. We can also point out that to the south, like Maryland and South, these are where the main slaveholding states are concentrated. Just to keep this in mind as we go forward, talking about these things. So in terms of population, large states wanted the representation in the new national government to be a function of how many citizens basically you had in your state. So, for instance, Virginia, which we just said, here at this time it's one of the more populous states of the 13. They wanted the new national government to be centered around a bicameral legislature. Bicameral meaning two separate chambers in Congress. They wanted each chamber to be determined based on the population of each state. So a large state like Virginia would have more representatives in each of the chambers than smaller states. Obviously, if you're Virginia, this is what you want. This gives you more power and more influence to direct the federal government in whichever way you want. Obviously, though, the smaller states don't really like this plan. A state like New Jersey thinks that the larger states are just going to use this to really push their own interests, probably at the expense of the interests of the smaller states. So this isn't really a plan that works for them at all. As an alternative, You have the New Jersey plan, which called for a unicameral legislature, which would have been a Congress composed of only one chamber, and this plan wanted each state to have equal representation in this chamber, regardless of how many people were living in the state. So this would have basically given small states with very relatively few people the same degree of influence on the national government as the larger states with comparatively a lot of people. So you have these two opposing plans, New Jersey and Virginia, really at opposite ends of the spectrum. What eventually happens, and this becomes a refrain at the convention, is that there's a compromise arrived at. It's known as the Connecticut Compromise, and this is arranged such that we have a bicameral legislature, one house of which is determined based on representation. So in other words, the House of Representatives, that's what it ends up being called. States with larger population get more representatives in this chamber. However, the Senate is composed of equal representation regardless of population size. So in the Senate, as it turns out, every state gets 2 senators, no matter how many people are living within that state. And it's interesting to note, this is a compromise that enough states agreed to sort of resolve the issue sufficiently that the convention moves on and moves forward. However, how the voting breaks down, 5 in favor, 4 opposed, is obviously not a strong consensus at all. And this is something that occurs at numerous points of the convention, in that you have different states with very varying interests. They want different things. And what you see is just a compromise such that no one's really extremely satisfied with the outcome, but it's enough such that the convention continues and we can keep going toward the broader goal of instituting a new national government. All right. As far as representation goes, there's another split beyond population size, related to population size, but focusing on slavery. So given the Connecticut Compromise, which we just talked about, one house of Congress is going to be determined based on population. So in other words, the more people in the state, the more representatives in the House of Representatives you get. Given this, the question of how slaves should be counted for purposes of representation becomes important, right? So there's a substantial slave population, mostly in these states, in the South. So it's a question: how are they going to be counted? Are they going to be counted like citizens to give these states more representation, or left out? So obviously the southern states that had all these slaves wanted them to be counted for purposes of representation. If they could take all their, let's say you have 1 million free citizens in your state and maybe 500,000 slaves, if you do count those slaves toward representation, that's giving you 50% more influence in Congress, basically. So the southern states wanted the slaves to be counted fully. The northern states, you didn't want the slaves to be counted. First of all, they had their own interest that they didn't want the South to control the government completely. And there's also, obviously a tension here between the South's stance that these slaves should be counted, the same as citizens, but they're not willing to give any rights to them as citizens or even humans. So, obviously the northern delegates would be pointing out that hypocrisy as well. Again, a compromise is reached. Notice the 3/5 compromise is obviously, maybe the most infamous aspect of the Constitution, which is frequently cited as, unjust and kind of dehumanizing of the slave population. It is sort of misunderstood to the extent that oftentimes it's viewed as driven by the slave states and not wanting to recognize the slaves as humans, but really it's more of a practical matter of the northern states trying to really diminish the influence of the slave-holding states. The way the 3/5 number is arrived at is basically this. It's the number, the fraction that balances the amount of representation in Congress that the southern states have compared to the northern non-slave-holding states. So what this chart is showing, here you have various different schemes of representation as it pertains to slaves. 0 would mean if they're not counted at all for representation. 3/5 is the number we eventually arrive at. And here, 5/5 if they're counted fully, the same as a citizen. If you look at, if they're not counted at all, which would have been what the North wanted, the slaveholding states would have only controlled maybe about 40% of the seats in the House of Representatives. You look at it, if they were counted fully, which is what the South wanted, the slaveholding states would have held a slight majority in the House. So there's a big difference between this and this. Maybe not as much in absolute value, but when you're considering who has the majority, that's really what matters the most in Congress, is who has the majority, not as much by how much. The compromise here, the 3/5 compromise, is basically the number that equalizes the share representation between the slaveholding states and the non-slaveholding states. So this is basically a really a make or break point. The slaveholding states weren't going to enter into a new union with the non-slaveholding states if they thought that it was going to result in them being dictated to policy as it regards to slavery. So the 3/5 compromise, again, is something that neither side is really extremely satisfied with, but it furthers the goal of getting a draft document of the Constitution finished, one that could eventually have a chance of being actually ratified. Alright, so moving beyond representation, another important thing to figure out as the founders are putting together the new Constitution is what degree of public input is going to be allowed in government. So the framers wanted the people to have some voice in government, but at the same time they were wary of direct democracy. So these were all people that would have been educated in history. They would have been able to think back to times in like the classical period or whatever when democracy led to some really capricious and rash and ultimately destructive decisions, and so they weren't really in favor of giving the people the final say in what goes on in government. They wanted some degree of buffer between the potentially rash and maybe not well-informed views of the people and what the government is actually doing. So one broad way that this is addressed is we don't have a democracy. They didn't like democracy, they didn't institute a democracy. What we have is a system that's a republic, which is a system where people select the representatives in a democratic fashion, but the representatives are the ones that actually go into government and make the decisions ultimately. We vote for congressmen, president, congressmen or women, senators, president. All these people then go and make decisions on their own, hopefully with us in mind when they get into Washington, D.C., but we're the people, we're not actually entitled to any sort of direct influence over the government in Washington. Another way that the government is insulated from the influence of the will of the people is that terms are staggered. So in terms of the federal government, we have three, I just mentioned them, positions that we can vote for: the president, the senators, and representatives in the House. There's no no election that would allow us to fully throw out all of these people, all of these different positions. So senators are reelected every 6 years. The president serves 4-year terms. The House of Representatives every 2 years. The entire House goes up for re-election. The point being here, though, that any given election, it's impossible to vote everyone out of office if we wanted to. So even if something happens in the population and there's a dramatic shift in public sentiment, they're not going to be able to completely remove everyone from office who doesn't share that view. So this again provides a buffer against popular influence. Also notably, both the Senate and the President were originally selected by indirect means. In other words, the people weren't voting on them. As the Constitution was originally ratified, only the House of Representatives was selected directly by the people. The Senate would have been selected by state legislatures. The President selected by the Electoral College, where the electors to the Electoral College were originally selected mostly by state legislatures as well. There were a few states that held public elections to determine the Electoral College back in the early days, But most of the states didn't have popular elections for president. Most of them determined their electoral votes through the state legislature. As we go through history, of course, senators that's ultimately changed to allow people to vote for senators directly. This would be the 17th Amendment. Eventually, every state adopts popular elections to determine its electoral votes. So there's a high degree of direct influence by the people in both of these positions now. But as the document was originally crafted, the founders had a lot less popular will as an influence on these. Another important problem that the founders had to grasp and figure out how to deal with it at this convention dealt with interstate relations. So recall back to our discussion of the Articles of Confederation. This was a document that allowed each state to determine how it wanted to relate to any other state on its own. So any state could put a tax on another state. They could restrict travel between states. And this has the effect of really diminishing how much the economy can grow, right? If you've got to, you go back to the map, just as an aside, in a lot of these states, they're very densely populated, really compact. So if you've got to deal with changing policy when you travel, from Maryland to Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and all these states have different policies, that's really, not really incentivizing you to try to engage in commerce between the states. So this is something that the people at the Philadelphia Convention wanted to address, the way things are going here. And there are a few ways they did. First of all, the Supremacy Clause. This states that whenever there's a conflict between federal law and state law, the federal law is supreme. Second of all, the Commerce Clause gives the national government control over regulating commerce between the states. So in other words, this removes the power of any given state to tax or restrict travel between the states. That's it's up to the federal government to determine what those policies are. And in general, the federal government throughout our history has pursued a policy of freedom of travel between states. The Full Faith and Credit Clause. This is a clause in the Constitution that states that each state has to recognize the certifications and licenses and certified documents from other states. So basically, like if you get a driver's license, this is the easiest example. You have a driver's license in New York. It allows you to drive in New York. If you go to New Jersey, it allows you to drive to New Jersey. If you go to Pennsylvania, it allows you to drive in Pennsylvania. Throughout each of the 50 states, your driver's license is good, regardless of where it came from. Equal Privileges and Immunities Clause. This is a clause that says that no state can discriminate against people based on having come from some other state. So if New York, for instance, can't say that there's one set of criminal penalties, for instance, let's say burglary, if you're a resident of New York, and there's a different set of penalties that's greater if you come from outside of the state. Basically, everything has to apply equally regardless of which state you originate from. Another problem with the articles that we talked about was the lack of a coordinated approach throughout the country in terms of foreign threats. During this period, it's worth noting that there were several foreign threats in the immediate vicinity to us. Even on the continental United States, we had Britain with holdings, France had holdings, Spain had holdings, all within pretty close proximity to us. So it's important to come together as a nation and provide a sort of unified front against these nations. You can't really do that under the Articles of Confederation because each state is entitled to make its own foreign policy. The new Constitution, though, forbids states from conducting foreign policy on their own and leaves that completely up to the national government. So this alleviates a lot of the issues of not having a consistent front. Also on this note, speaking of the foreign threats, Congress has also given the power to tax directly. This is a big issue with the articles, as we discuss. Each tax requires unanimous consent within the legislative chamber. Here, though, we get the power to tax and the new Congress just by virtue of a simple majority in each house. This gives you, it's explicitly said that the Congress can pass laws to tax for the purposes of raising armies and maintaining a navy, both of which, raising armies usually back in this period of history, you didn't have much of a standing army, but it was important to be able to pay for soldiers and equipment when the need arose, especially a navy. A navy isn't really something that's easily cobbled together, whenever you need it. You really have to have a standing navy in order for it to be effective. And these were things that the new Constitution was allowing the new government to do more effectively. All right. One more broad thing to note as we talk about what's going on here as the new Constitution is being framed. Broadly speaking, we mentioned that the goal of this new government was not only to be able to govern more effectively than the Articles government, but also to keep preserving these natural rights, which was the entire purpose of declaring independence from Britain in the first place. So we didn't want to implement a new government that was going to roll these things back. One of the ways that the new government is designed to protect these and to make sure that the national government doesn't overreach its powers and start infringing on rights is by embedding checks and balances into the document and separating the different locuses of power within the new government. So for instance, you see, first of all, note that the new government is composed of three separate branches: a legislative branch, the Congress, an executive branch, i.e. the president, and then a judiciary branch. This is entirely new. First of all, there was no president under the Articles of Confederation government. Because you're introducing this new executive, it's important to make sure he doesn't gain too much power for himself and start using it in the manner of a king. So you have these different checks on the presidency embedded within Congress. The Congress can override presidential vetoes. The president is highly dependent on Congress for appointments, ratifying treaties. We'll get into a lot of these different details more as we get into these specific lectures on Congress and the president. The president also, he has a check on Congress. If Congress tries to get out of line and start conducting business in a way that isn't conducive to maintaining natural rights, the president, he can veto bills. He has some power to go outside of Congress to do executive agreements and orders. You also have the judiciary down here, which is there in large part to make sure that Congress and the president aren't doing anything that's inconsistent with what's stated in the Constitution. So, like I said, we'll get more into detail in what these specific checks and balances are. It's important for you to know them as we go forward in the semester. Also to recognize broadly what the purpose of all this is. They're there to make sure that no branch of government gets out of line and starts exerting more power than it should, especially toward the end of reducing rights and liberties in the country. All right, so we're at the point now to where this new Constitution has been crafted at the Philadelphia Convention. What happens, though, is it doesn't immediately go into effect. Once it's written, you have to have some degree of support, obviously, from the states that are going to be making up this new government, or else it's not going to have any legitimacy. So within the document, as it's finished, they say that once 9 states have agreed to the Constitution to ratify it, it'll go into effect. And if we don't get nine states, then it doesn't go into effect, basically. So after the Constitution is finished, the manuscript is written, a debate starts emerging in public squares, in newspapers, over whether it should be ratified or not. You had those that were in favor of ratification, called the Federalists, those who were opposed to it, called the Anti-Federalists, and consistent with the broader intellectual and ideological atmosphere of the time, the primary debate is over liberty. Specifically, we've got this new government that we're proposing. Is it going to adequately protect liberty? Speaking in terms of the Anti-Federalists, these were people who were sort of skeptical as to whether that would be the case. They would have said that this new constitution, it's giving too much power to the new government, and it's basically undoing what we already did. So we just got done less than a decade ago fighting this war against Great Britain. It was expensive. It cost a lot of lives. The entire purpose of this was to make sure our liberties were protected. And this new government, you're giving it all this new power. You're introducing a potentially powerful executive branch. This is basically undoing, what we've already fought for and what we've already done. They make a few suggestions as to how to remedy things. The anti-federalists would have been people that, these are all smart people, and they're not going to sit there and try to tell you that the Articles of Confederation are perfect and that everything's working the way it should. But so they offer a few suggestions going forward to maybe make things more workable, either under the Articles or ways to change the Constitution to make it more favorable to their viewpoint. So they wanted to reduce the purview of the federal judiciary, the types of cases it could hear. If we're going to create this new chief executive, the president, they wanted a separate council to be able to sit in and review his decisions and potentially check the president in that way. They didn't want to give the new national government sole power over the military. They wanted to leave the military mostly to the states, and this is just so that if the federal government does get out of line, it doesn't also, it's not impinging on liberties and doing it under the force of the military. If the states still have control over their individual state militias, this gives them some ability to resist the federal government if it tries to get out of line. So this is something that the anti-federalists wanted. They wanted more members in the House than, this was like I said, the only branch directly elected by the people, and they wanted more representatives in the House than was agreed to at the Philadelphia Convention. Maybe most famously, they wanted to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, so an explicit listing of certain rights that we hold, and with them a guarantee that the government isn't going to infringe on them. The Federalists, of course, these were the group of people that were in favor of the Constitution. Most of them had a hand in actually writing it. So they wanted to ratify it as it was written. And most famously, these arguments are outlined in the Federalist Papers, which are a series of articles published by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay in certain newspapers, where they're just outlining and basically trying to take the points made by the Anti-Federalists and rebut them and put forth their own argument as to why this new Constitution is going to improve the state of things. Ultimately, though, the public sentiment is such that most people are recognizing that some change is necessary. You've got several events that bring the inadequacy of the Articles of Confederation into keen light. For instance, Shays' Rebellion, which is a rebellion that breaks out in the federal government's for a long period of time just completely impotent to put it down. So the government under the Articles doesn't even have the ability to really enforce order within its own boundaries. There are several other problems that we discuss in terms of the economy. So the sentiment is just such that something needs to be changed, and this ultimately ends up favoring the Federalists, who we go forward and they get the minimum of 9 states that they need to ratify. This is happening in 1788. Eventually, because you get these 9 states, they start making plans to transition from the Articles Congress to this new government, and this occurs on March 4th, 1789. Interestingly, though, by the time that George Washington takes office as the first president, a little bit later on in April, only 11 states had ratified the new Constitution at this point. So the 2 states that did are Rhode Island and North Carolina. As the new United States government originally forms, it's only composed of 11 states. Of course, North Carolina and Rhode Island eventually get on board, which is it's just an interesting bit of history, and it illustrates that the debate here wasn't really that one-sided. There were substantial factions in certain regions and certain states that weren't necessarily fully in favor of this new government. The final thing we're going to talk about in this lecture, now that we've discussed what leads up to the Constitution, what the broad principles of the document are, it's important to recognize that it's an imperfect document, right? So we can think of numerous aspects of it that have proven to be either unfair or inadequate throughout the country's history. So our final topic is going to be talking about how it can be changed when this is the case. How we can add text to the Constitution, basically to improve it. And here are just a list of several examples of when this has occurred throughout history. Voting is one obvious example. When the Constitution was originally ratified, voting rights were really only extended to a small subsection of the population. Going forward, we have amendments added, like the 15th, the 19th, which extend suffrage. To this point, we're now, today, basically every adult has a right to vote. Equal rights in slavery. Obviously, we start out from a position, the Constitution as it's originally ratified permits slavery. It's originally changed to prohibit slavery and also extend rights to persecuted groups. Taxation, another great example. Up until the 16th Amendment, the federal government had no right to directly tax people's income. Post-16th Amendment, though, income taxes have become really the largest source of revenue for the federal government. So this is a pretty dramatic departure from how things worked as the Constitution was originally, and how it originally set up the government, and how it is now. Presidential term limits. There used to be informal limits. Now there are formal limits as imposed by the amendment process. Alcohol prohibition was first introduced, then repealed through amendment. Inauguration dates. This is something relevant, I guess, given the current political events going on. Inauguration used to be in March. Through amendment, it was then brought earlier to January the 20th. So a few short weeks from now, we'll have a presidential inauguration because of an amendment that was introduced. Right. So the term amendment basically just means adding text to the Constitution. It could really be anything. It could be altering something about what's going on in in some section of the Constitution, adding provisions, repealing provisions, as we've seen with prohibition. So amendments are a formal way to add text to the Constitution which changes its meaning. Another way that we're going to talk about the Constitution being changed is judicial review, which does not involve any text being added to the Constitution, but instead involves the federal courts reinterpreting the Constitution through their case rulings. Judicial review is a concept we'll talk about in more detail when we get into the lecture on the federal judiciary, where it's obviously a very relevant topic. We'll cover it a little bit here as we close, though, as well. All right, so speaking first of all about the amendment process and the textual changes to the Constitution, the amendment process is outlined in Article 5 of the Constitution. Importantly, it's a process that requires action on the part of both Congress and the states. Interestingly, though, amendments do not require any action by the President. It's a relatively rare process. Throughout our history, only 27 amendments have been added to the Constitution. This is just because there's a pretty high threshold to cover in order to successfully get the support needed to ratify them. And I'll outline that here in a second, and you'll see the thresholds. And the latest amendment that's been added was in 1992, which a lot of you who are listening to this may have not even been alive in 1992. So this goes to illustrate, obviously it's a pretty rare process if the last one was this far back. All right, getting into some of the technical aspects and requirements. In this chart, let's sort of ignore this bubble down here on the bottom left for now. It's not as important as what's going on in these other sections here. So amendments usually begin, in Congress, right? This is something, I'll mention it briefly at the end. This has never been done before. The proposal in Congress, this process has been initiated several, every one of the amendments, every 27 of them, has started in Congress. And Congress's role in this is basically just, once it gets an amendment, to vote on it, and if it gets 2/3 approval in both houses of Congress, in other words, the Senate and the House, it can proceed on. If it fails to get a 2/3 majority in either house, it fails. So right off the bat, Congress's role in this involves a pretty high threshold. At no point in modern political history have we had a Congress where both chambers have 2/3 of a majority by a single party. This is just a really, really high level of consensus that's usually not found in Congress. So at any time that Congress is considering an amendment, it has to have some degree of bipartisan support, which also coincidentally, we're a more polarized nation as far as partisanship goes. So we're at a point in time in history where Democrats are probably less likely to agree with Republicans than ever before, and vice versa. So first of all, the proposal process is very difficult to get past. If this does happen, though, in the rare case that there's something that 2/3 of both houses of Congress agree on, it then goes up to the states to determine whether or not it's ratified. And this can proceed in two different ways. It can either be voted on by state legislatures, or the Constitution also gives Congress the ability to instead send it to special ratifying conventions held in each state. This is a rarer occurrence than the voting by state legislatures. It's only been employed once for the 21st Amendment. So most of the time, once Congress sends an amendment out, it goes to state legislatures, and each state can choose whether they don't actually have to even vote on it, but if they do, they just have a straight up or down vote in their state legislatures to determine whether they want to ratify it or not. And you need approval in 3/4 of the state. So in other words, 38 out of 50. And here you see another really high threshold, right? There aren't very many political controversies today where you're going to find consensus across 38 out of the 50 states. It's just a very, very difficult margin to obtain. And so we get back to the fact that only 27 amendments have been passed throughout the country's history. This is why. You have high threshold in Congress, high threshold in the states, both of which, when you combine, it's just an extremely difficult process to complete. And this is really designed on purpose by the founders. They wanted some procedure in place to allow for the Constitution to be changed when it was obviously needed, but they didn't want really anything to be done on a whim. They didn't want the amendment process and the changes of the Constitution to be something that's resorted to casually or not as a last resort. They wanted some stability in the governing system. Now, getting back to this dash box down here, there's another pathway to amend the Constitution that's completely separate from everything that's going on up here, whereby the Constitution says that on the request of 2/3 of the states, it's possible that Congress can form a convention to amend the Constitution. So, as I noted before, this has never actually been done, so it's not as important to note, but in theory, this is one possible way that the Constitution could be changed. It's not immediately clear how it would work, because it's never been done. But in theory, if enough states get together, they can force Congress to call this convention, at which point you could make possibly wholesale changes to the Constitution. It's not really that well explained in Article 5 what would go on here. So in general, this isn't really the more important amendment process for you to be aware of. A few other interesting notes about the amendment process. So there's a pretty high degree of variance in terms of the length it takes. The shortest amendment from proposal in Congress to ratification by the requisite number of states was 107 days. On the other hand, the longest process was over the span of 202 years, this being the 27th Amendment, which interestingly was approved by Congress at the same time as the Bill of Rights. So you have the first 10 amendments, which we all recognize and know, and if we don't, that's fine, because we'll be having an entire lecture about them here soon when we talk about civil liberties. But the 27th Amendment is an amendment that would have been, I think, the 12th if it had been ratified at the same time as the Bill of Rights amendments. There's one that didn't pass, which I think was the 11th, and then the 12th was eventually passed as the 27th. This is just interesting to show that after all these years, it finally got the requisite number of states. It got up to that three-fourths threshold and became an actual amendment. Out of the amendments opposed to Congress each year, of which there are hundreds, like I said, that getting the 2/3 threshold in each house is really difficult. However, once you do obtain approval in Congress, if you do get past that hurdle of 2/3 majority in the Senate and the House, usually you have a pretty good chance of having the states approve that amendment. There's only been 6 instances throughout our history where an amendment has been approved by Congress, but has failed to be ratified in the states. So you can see here a list of these. Let's see. This is the one I was talking about. That was also passed on the same time as the Bill of Rights amendments in 1789. This is one that was only ratified by 11 states, dealing with congressional apportionment. Apportionment being the assignment of representatives to states, and the number of representatives you get. But this was not passed. The rest of the Bill of Rights, amendments 1 through 10, were obviously passed during a lot closer to their approval by Congress, and then you have the 27th here, which was passed, but just 200 years later. But getting back to this chart, it's just interesting to look at these. You see some of them are still pending. In other words, if any of these did get to the minimum 38 states, they could still be approved as amendments. A few others down here, though, are interesting in that they've expired. So one thing that Congress can do is when they approve an amendment, in the language they can put sunset provisions such that if it doesn't pass by this period of time, in this case, the Equal Rights Amendment had to pass by 82, DC voting rights by 85. If it doesn't meet that requirement, it expires. So here, 35 states have approved the Equal Rights Amendment. That falls 3 short of the 38. It can't be now that the 3 additional states decide tomorrow to vote on it and pass it and make it an amendment, because it's already expired. So this is up to Congress, basically, when they word the amendment, whether they want it to have an expiration provision or not. This is just a handy chart of all 27 amendments that have been passed so far. You can see they break down roughly into useful categories, either relationships between people and government, the structure of government, the composition of the electorate, or the powers in government. I'm not going to get into discussing all of these in detail, but in general, it's good for you to know what each of them do. There's only 27, so it's not that difficult to familiarize yourself with them. All right, and finally, but beyond the amendment process, which, as I said, is a formal way to add text to the Constitution, another way that the Constitution has changed, not in text, but practically, is through judicial review. So Congress isn't permitted to pass laws that are inconsistent with the Constitution. The president isn't allowed to take executive actions that are inconsistent with the Constitution. And one of the key jobs of the Supreme Court is to determine and interpret the Constitution, to determine what is constitutional and what is not. What is constitutional and what is not unconstitutional. This is notably not something that's found within the Article 3 description of the judicial branch. The Constitution doesn't say that the Supreme Court is in charge of determining what is and what isn't constitutional. This is a power that's assumed after the ratification in a famous case called Marbury v. Madison, where the Supreme Court takes it upon itself to say that we basically have the ability to say that something is constitutional or not constitutional and enforce the law in such a way. So the significance here in terms of changing the Constitution is basically that even though the text isn't changing as a result of court rulings, practicing judicial review oftentimes has the effect of changing the way the Constitution is applied. So even though the actual language, there's any language being added to it, the Constitution is still changing in a practical sense. A few examples. Plessy v. Ferguson is another famous court case, rather an infamous one, I suppose, in which the Supreme Court holds that segregation is permitted under the Constitution. This is where the separate but equal doctrine comes from. This is in 1896. You go forward about 60 years into the future to 1954. Another landmark case, Brown v. Board of Education, overturns this and says separate is inherently unequal. So nothing's changing about the Constitution here in terms of the language. What's changing is the way that the court is interpreting the Constitution, which in fact, again, has the practical effect, a practical effect, but not necessarily a formal change. This is what we mean when we talk about judicial review changing the Constitution. Worker v. Filburn is a case pertaining to the Commerce Clause. I mentioned this earlier in terms of the federal government having the authority to regulate commerce between the states. So this is a clause that was interpreted pretty narrowly for most of the country's history up until maybe the 1930s and 40s, where the federal government was allowed to obviously regulate interstate commerce, but anything that was going on within a particular state, the federal government didn't really have much authority to affect. Worker v. Filburn here is a famous case where basically the Supreme Court says that the government has the right not only to regulate commerce going between the states, but any commerce within a state that has the effect of influencing markets that operate between states. So in other words, this gives the federal government a pretty wide range of options to do whatever it wants to regulate the economy under the Commerce Clause. So again, we're going from sort of a narrow interpretation of the clause that doesn't give the federal government that much leeway in regulating the economy to the Supreme Court changing its interpretation to allow the federal government to do a lot more. So nothing changing in the text, just the way the Constitution is applied as a result of the judicial review. And finally, incorporation. This is something that'll come up again in terms of federalism in civil liberties. I mentioned the Bill of Rights a few times now. This is just the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, where things like free speech, freedom of religion, rights against unreasonable searches, most of the really core liberties that we enjoy are enumerated. As it was originally written and interpreted, though, the Bill of Rights protections only applied to the federal government. So the National Congress in Washington, D.C. wasn't allowed to pass laws that restrict free speech, but the Constitution wasn't interpreted to apply to the states. So, if New York wanted to pass a law that restricted free speech, it would be free to, at least under the Constitution. There may be something in their state constitution or their state laws that prevent that, but the federal, the document we're talking about in this lecture, that didn't prevent them from doing so. That's the way the court approaches things up until about the early 20th century. Gitlow v. New York is the court case I cite here, which sort of kicks off the doctrine of incorporation, where the Supreme Court begins saying that no, these aren't just protections that apply to the national government. States, for instance, New York, also are not allowed to restrict free speech. So again, we're not adding anything to the Constitution in terms of language. It's just the court is changing how the Constitution is applied and interpreted. Okay, so that is the end of our discussion of the Constitution. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture.